What are Max and Ruby up to today? Find out after this on Nick Jr. What's Max up to today? Find out in Max and Ruby. Next on Nick Jr.
Oh, Better, I love you.
Shoo Shoo Mummy Make Me Better from Zapf Cream.
Who makes that sound? That's right, it's Peppa Pig. She's coming up right after this on Nick Jr. 2. Hey, Peppa Pig is on her way. Get ready to join in the fun next on Nick Jr. 2.
It's time for yummy fun. It's fun to skip and it's fun to watch Pick Me. Next on Nick Jr.
Stay tuned because Super Y is coming up after this on Nick Jr. Super Y is coming up next on Nick Jr.
It's time to wiggle. Next on Nick Jr. It's time to wiggle. Next on Nick Jr. Get wiggling with the Wiggles here on Nick Jr. Next on Nick Jr. Up next on Nick Jr. is Wow Wow Bubsy. Wow Wow Wubsy is coming up next on Nick Jr. The Backyardigans are coming up next on Nick Jr. Stay tuned to Nick Jr. because coming up after the break are the Backyardigans.
Help Kevin search for clues in Blue's Clues right after this on Nick Jr. 2.
Stay tuned to Nick Jr. Next on Nick Jr. is the flowery Fifi and her flower top friends. Coming up next on Nick Jr. are Fifi and the Flower Tots.
What's going on in Lazy Town? Find out after this on Nick Jr.
If you go down to the woods today, you'll find Little Bear with all his friends. They'll be right here after this on Nick Jr. 2. It's time for another story with Little Bear and his friends. Next on Nick Jr. 2. Our 3 friends are on a desert island and the beast is knocking down some coconuts. Tasty! Join Maggie next on Nick Jr.
Catch up with Maggie. Next on Nick Jr. It's time to play with Maggie and the ferocious beast. Next on Nick Jr. What's Maggie looking for?
Aha!
The ferocious beast. They're coming up next on Nick Jr. Has Beast got himself into another sticky situation? Find out after this on Nick Jr.